Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Mr. Moritz Leuenberger, Federal Councillor and Head of the Department of the Environment, Transport and Energy Communications of the Swiss Confederation, to my dear colleagues, Pachi, Michel, and also Roberto, and to all of you who have come here not only for this session of the IPCC, but indeed to celebrate what we discussed and Mr. Leuenberger called quite a phenomenon, namely that at the age of 20, you already receive a Nobel Peace Prize. It is indeed, as you said, Councillor, that it is a remarkable testimony to an idea whose time had not only come, but for which the world was searching. And I believe the award, not only of the Nobel Peace Prize, but also the centrality that the IPCC has taken in helping a world for the first time in political terms in history to have to find a way to come together despite so many different national realities, national interests, perceptions of double standards, I think is indeed a testimony to the power of knowledge on the one hand, and that is partly what the IPCC also signifies. It is the power of knowledge that we as human communities and societies had accumulated at the end of the 20th century to begin to understand what otherwise would have simply been described as phenomena. It is also the role of science, and I have always been intrigued by the very strict interpretation of the IPCC's role as being policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. It begs some questions about the future of how societies will invest in science, how the international community of nation states will indeed invest in processes such as the IPCC and platforms in order to create perhaps a platform that allows collective action to occur despite all the differences because of the imperative of knowledge and science. The fact that the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, Pachi, is also, in a sense, to be viewed in a pattern of how peace prizes have been awarded in the last few years. Indeed, Wangari Maathai and also our colleague Mohamed Yunus stand alongside the IPCC as a statement of the Nobel Committee that the underlying factors of peace and coexistence and cooperation on our planet are beginning to take center stage. I take you back for a moment to 1988. It was the time, Secretary General, when indeed Korea and Seoul were hosting the Summer Olympic Games. It was the time when the first fair trade label was launched in the Netherlands and smiled and belittled by many, I think, in the mainstream of the economy. And it was also the year when UN peacekeepers received the Nobel Peace Prize. We have come a long way since then, and I believe the fact that climate change, the IPCC, the UNFCCC, the United Nations, the Secretary General, namely multilateralism as a framework for trying to address both a contested phenomenon, a differential response, the need for a ultimately legally binding instrument, the necessity to negotiate equitable approaches in addressing this phenomenon, all this has converged around the evolution of the IPCC, the Convention, and indeed the role of the United Nations and, Secretary General, your role at this particular point in time, which is to bring about something that we have never quite had to confront in this way, which is that a phenomenon of environmental change induced by human activity, notwithstanding the question marks that remain, the areas that need to be intensified in terms of research, has for the first time illustrated to us that the paradigm with which particularly the 20th century set about improving the human condition was at the same time beginning to undermine the very progress that it set in motion. The transition that the IPCC is beginning to encapsulate and articulate is, in my mind, also one that is far more far-reaching than just the power of scientific facts and research. Through knowledge and science, we are creating an imperative to act and also an imperative to rethink how our societies and economies will develop in the future. You all know that we are in the midst of a moment in time when economic recession An oil price of $120, $130 is beginning to raise questions about, can we afford to respond to climate change in the way that we were even only discussing last year? I think this will be one of the interesting moments of the next 12 to 24 months, alongside the negotiation process leading up to Copenhagen. How far have we moved as societies, as political leaders, in recognizing that the 21st century will reshape the paradigm that defines the scope for development and the nature of development? I truly believe that we are at the beginning of confronting a fact that the environmental or nature-based, whatever you wish to call it, parameters of our planet are forcing us to rethink how economics plays a role. It is also a moment in time when environmentalists have to begin to think economically and economists have to begin to become environmentally more intelligent, because without that transition on either side of the, to my mind, totally artificial polarity of the 20th century, there is neither an answer to the transition in terms of global warming, nor indeed the more fundamental and underlying challenge of moving towards a greener or more efficient and more intelligent economy. With 10 billion people, the phenomenon of climate change is just one of many we will face. And amongst us, I think, is Bob Watson. I can't see him here, but I know we were together in Torino yesterday. He also chaired the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remember, as human beings, with the economic drivers of the last century, we have brought our planet already to the point where many of the fundamental life-sustaining systems are not just beginning to grumble, they're in fact beginning to falter. But does that mean development will somehow have to stop and economic growth is no longer possible? No, but it has to be under a different paradigm. And that raises the question of how will the power of science, the power of the IPCC, fare in a world where economics has always been taken as the definitional fundamental orientation point. And I would say today that part of the power of the IPCC came at the moment in time when economics became an integral part of trying to understand not only the policy relevant findings, but indeed the also economically relevant findings. We all remember Sir Nicholas Stern's report and how it opened the eyes, or perhaps took the lid of a discussion that finally empowered the economic actors in our society to recognize that climate change is an environmental change phenomenon with fundamental consequences for every aspect of our economies and societies. As we look forward to the future work of the IPCC, I want to join my friend Michel Jarraud in saying that indeed for WMO and UNEP, the journey of the IPCC, and I want to also recognize here our predecessors who in many ways were perhaps part of that visionary group of individuals who at a time when most people belittled the notion that a panel of scientists could change the nature of an international political and economic process, when they had the courage to put their own reputation and their institutions behind this initiative. Today we stand ready more than ever, I would say, excited by the success of the IPCC, but also driven by the enormous necessity of the work that you have done, that your colleagues who are perhaps not in the IPCC today any longer have done in the past, how central that tool of science to inform not only policymakers, but to empower the public. 2007 was the year when climate change, in my mind at least, moved outside the conference rooms into the public arena, when the public began not to understand the kilos of IPCC reports, but began to believe that there was enough seriousness in what the IPCC was saying to challenge their own political leaders. And I end by referring back to my notion that I alluded to at the beginning. Science is knowledge, and thus it is power, but also empowerment of politicians, yes, businessmen and women, civic leaders, the United Nations for that matter, but also the public. And I think we should never forget that. The dictionary defines an imperative as a plea, a duty, something that is impossible to evade or ignore. It is an obligation. This is what the IPCC has handed to our generation of leaders, presidents, prime ministers, politicians, indeed to this generation overall. Facts and figures that cannot be ignored, and a duty and an obligation to act, and to act fast. In that sense, the IPCC is not only policy relevant, it is indeed today part of an imperative for societies to respond. We honor you in terms of what you have achieved, and we commit ourselves to working with you in the years ahead in terms of the role that you as scientists, and with you the whole scientific community around the globe, have to deliver in order to make sure that the 21st century does indeed define a different paradigm than the last one did. Thank you.
Mr. Roberto Acosta.